Hi, Vivian. Thanks for joining me.
It's always fun.
I think we're going to have a great chat today. Pretty exciting topic, something that you and I have talked about a couple of times in the last couple of years too. So, welcome to everyone who's joining us. This is one of those recorded panels, a bit of a chat between Vivian and I about neurotechnology. For those who don't know, neurotechnology is technology that interfaces directly with the human brain. And it can be very direct. It can be implanted in the skull and require brain surgery, or it can be quite a lot more indirect stuff that's indirectly inferring from our interactions with existing technology like our phones, what's going on even. So there's a broad definition for you to kind of understand what we're talking about. I think the stuff that we'll be talking about today will be a bit more brain focused than the broader stuff, but we're also not going to be talking about the stuff that's been implanted in your brain by brain surgery. We're going to be talking about some of the more non-invasive stuff, similar to what my company Hum does, and also something that Vivian's very interested in. So, Vivian, I would love to just have you introduce yourself and everyone to find out a bit about your background.
Absolutely. So it's probably worth saying, for the purpose of this discussion, that long ago, when I was interviewing to go to grad school, I would ask the people next to me, young undergrads, trying to get into a neuroscience program somewhere. So what do you want to research? And they would say something like, well, there's this protein cascade in yeast. And of course, in my head, I'm thinking, what the hell does that have to do with neuroscience? But for any of you who don't know, to a molecular neuroscientist, we are all approximately yeast. Really, the differences are pretty minimal. It's like a spherical cow situation. And they say, what do you want to research? And I would say cyborgs. And they would literally scoot away from me for fear that my crazy would rub off and they wouldn't get in either. But, as you were suggesting, this is not so crazy an idea anymore. And while we may not be talking about certainly cyborgs like the Borg or RoboCop, there is huge work and advances that have been made, ranging from deep brain stimulation and motor neuroprosthetics, robotic limbs driven by our own motor cortex. Those would be invasive chronic implants, all the way through to work I've been able to do looking at brain stimulation, looking at predicting manic episodes, trying to improve face recognition in autistic children. Like, there's this huge realm of things that so many of us take for granted. The ability to speak for a paralyzed person, or to reach for a cup of coffee, that so many of our fellows on this planet they don't get to take it for granted. And we live in a science fictional enough universe where kooky people like us actually get to build this stuff, not just as homebrew products and projects, but for direct medical applications, and in many cases, just about improving our own well-being. And it's really exciting to live in the world that when I read The Diamond Age and other inspirational pieces of science fiction, and I think, God, I want to build something like that. When I was a kid, or even not as a kid, like, this is a thing I get to do as a job. So I've started a number of companies. I've been an academic researcher at Stanford and Cal, and nowadays I largely do philanthropic research, and a real focal area is this work on neuroprosthetics, neurotechnologies, sitting on a number of boards and advising a number of companies.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I'll give a tiny bit of an introduction to me, and then I'll explain how I came to meet Vivian and the journey that we're on together a little bit too. My name's Ian. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of the company based in Berkeley, but we started, as you may be able to tell from my accent, in a place far away in Western Australia. About 2012, there was some research going on that my co-founder was involved with. His name's Dr. Fury, is a medical doctor in Australia. That they were using powerful magnets on people's brains, not putting them inside the brains, but putting basically like a hat on, and then putting an electric signal through a magnet that would then cause the electrical signals in the brain to change, something called TMS. And I was studying physics and law. I was just a normal young person on his way to a career. I'd been interested in entrepreneurship and stuff like that, but had never been on the path to start a neuroscience company. I was in the middle of college, and at that time, to discover that there was this technology which could do the things that I had discovered in that study, in that research that I participated in, was mind-blowing. And it really opened the window onto this huge field of the stuff that Vivian was just talking about, which is these technologies that can directly influence normal, everyday people, but also, really sick people, like Vivian was talking about, people who have difficulty stemming from how their brains work, and make a big difference in all of these people's lives. And it's technology that's been in the lab for a while. We've had some really interesting, exciting things happen, but what's really fascinating and what we're here to talk about today is its path out of the lab and into the real world, and some of the interesting issues and challenges and exciting opportunities involved in that. Yeah, we're here today to have just a conversation about some of the emerging trends, how they impact people's lives, and also just talk about some of the challenges in the neuroscience field and neurotech field. We're going to spend the next about 45 minutes just diving into a couple of questions. And Vivian, I'll start you off with a question about what you see as the big trends that you're seeing emerge in these technologies that interface with the brain right now. A bit of a broad question to start you off.
Yeah, that is pretty broad. And yet, you can look at trends in terms of what's the cutting edge of the bioengineering research, what is sort of the cutting edge in trends in actual application, and even just what are the problems people are working on. And I think what's interesting is that last one, it's the same ones that I was interested in 20 years ago. On my website for decades, I had just this little inexplicable line, unless you were an aficionado of scientific publications. It said, what if it was 20 plus or minus 2? And it was a reference to this, one of the most influential and famous scientific papers of all time, certainly psychology papers of all time, where the title was The Magic Number 7 plus or minus 2. And it was talking about the earliest work establishing this concept of working memory, how much things people can keep in memory at any given time. And it relates to attention, it relates to the complexity of an argument you can follow. And it turns out it's interesting more than just as a passing scientific curiosity. A paper just in the domain of COVID-19, people with larger working memory spans were more likely to wear masks. They show lower infection rates. People with larger working memories, roughly a half of a standard deviation of increase in working memory span. So I already gave you that spread, 7 plus or minus 2. We'll skip defining what those numbers mean. But let's just say, you're an 8 or a 9. Turns out that ties into about a 30% increase in wages and earnings. So these are real world variables. And 20 years ago, when I was going around telling people I wanted to build cyborgs, that was actually what I meant. I've done work on cochlear implants, which is probably the neuroprosthetic most people are most familiar with. A hearing aid, that's not what this is, but a hearing aid, but one that actually wires into the 8th cranial nerve, into the auditory nerve, and restores hearing to people that are profoundly deaf. So to know that the same questions are what we're still trying to address: memory deficits, emotional instability, things like anxiety and suicidal ideation, paralysis, Parkinson's disease, those haven't changed. That's still the trend, is solve these core problems. We're just so much closer to it now because of changes in those other domains. So I think one of the big trends is if you were a cyberpunk fan, you were probably raised thinking of brain-computer interfaces as things you literally like plug into your head, like you plug in a printer or the amplifier for your guitar or something. Certainly, if you played Shadowrun or Cyberpunk 2020, God, it is disturbing to think that we're now in 2021. Then that was exactly what you did to log in to the net in those role-playing games. Well, now brain-computer interfaces are non-invasive systems. So one of the more exciting trends that one of the companies I advise focuses in on is mashing up the ability to read brain activity, in this case using EEG. So looking at the electrical activity that bleeds through to the scalp. Combine that with machine learning. Couldn't have done this. Even 5 years ago, this would have been absolute bleeding edge. But now advances in deep neural networks mean you can take this smeared, useless electrical activity on the scalp, useless from a single person in a single instance, and suddenly you can tell what's going on. And then linking that back into a closed loop for an augmented reality system. So in this particular case, you might be profoundly paralyzed, unable even to speak. And yet by tracking eye movements with cameras and looking with these systems that are picking up on attentional cues, the system can actually figure out what it is you're trying to identify and allow these people that might otherwise be locked in to their bodies to interact with the rest of the world, activate things in their immediate environments. And again, sounds like science fiction, but the chance to be a part of actually building this right now, give upwards of 100,000 people in the United States with advanced cerebral palsy the chance to interact with their world. That is an exciting transformation. So that's one, matching up old school EEG with machine learning and augmented reality. Super exciting. Another big trend is actually closing the loop of the whole system. So using EEG to do non-invasive readout, but feeding it back in using things like ultrasound or steerable magnetoinductive systems. And of course, as Hum is intimately familiar with, using technologies like transcranial alternating current stimulation. So you brought up the magnets early on. I mean, magnets, the results there were really interesting, but, and what's freaky about all of this is we didn't know what the biophysics was going on. It's just, wow, if you put a magnet really close to this part of a rat, then this really interesting thing happens. If you put it in the wrong part, you zap the pons and it stops breathing. But, if you do this one part of their barofields that control their whiskers, you see this crazy behavior. No one knew that what you were doing was causing like the poles of all these individual neurons in your brains to like line up, sync up, and then go crazy. So we could like have like this transient little stroke and figure out what that part of the brain was doing. But now we can do something so much richer, which is drive synchrony across brain regions, or look at phase locking within certain regions and induce with a great deal of precision. And again, with the potential to marry these two things together, the EEG readout, the phasic stimulation plus machine learning. Again, you wouldn't have been able to do this 5-10 years ago, and yet this is a big new trend in the space with wide applications. So, again, the exciting things have been moving away from the idea that the only progress here is going to be drilling a hole in someone's skull, jamming a bunch of wires in there, looking like you're a member of the Borg, to systems you could literally just take off and put on as you need them, whether conceptually or literally. That's really exciting. I will, even though it's not a focal point of our discussion, I'll also say there's really interesting trends in chronic implantation, building, looking at the biophysics of systems that are chronically inside your brain, which allows a different level of control and finesse. And knowing that this might be something that is a part of you for the rest of your life, building something that's a safe part of that. Lots of advances there in areas like neural dust and expandable nets, injectable nets. Like, these are exciting spaces. And again, if you were me and it was theoretical neuroscience and science fiction, and that's how people saw this field, and now you have the chance to take someone with a memory deficit or someone with cerebral palsy and make a difference in their life. Like, I get to live in science fiction. It's really cool.
Yeah, a couple of just fascinating trends there. I think obviously as science develops and we get a better understanding of the brain, the tools develop as well, and we're better able to just increase the quality of that technological interface where we can collect more data. Some of the things that Vivian was just talking about, EEG is basically just a little headset with a couple of little either sticky electrodes or like pieces of metal, just pull electricity. They just conduct electricity that goes through the outside the brain, through the skull, through the skin, and yet the data that you can get out of something like that is able to tell you how someone is thinking and feeling. And some of the trends that we're seeing is as the quality of that data and the ability to collect it gets easier, and it gets put together with other technologies like what Vivian was mentioning with the transcranial stimulation stuff. It's just opening entirely new doors for what's possible for us using neurotechnology to enhance our brains and choose how we think and feel. So yeah, really cool. I'm super fascinated, Vivian, by what you've seen in maybe the last 10 years of these different technologies, not necessarily neurotechnologies even, adding together and becoming more than the sum of their parts. I know you do some really fascinating research using AI. Could you tell us a little bit about how your experience in machine learning is kind of crossing over with your experience in neurotechnology?
Yeah, well, I mean, as someone that wanted to build cyborgs, but for certain experimental domains, it wasn't really a career plan. So I studied this field called theoretical neuroscience, which was really using machine learning to study the brain and sort of vice versa. And a lot of the work being there ended up being foundational for the development of deep neural networks, this new class of AI that really has been responsible for the recent revolution in the field, where suddenly these systems are comparable to, and in some cases better than, the best human performers in their space. AlphaGo, there's some really fun things, building systems that learn how to play soccer games or first-person shooters better than humans can play them. And seeing those things come out left me with the sense of, what if we did this in education? What if we did this to combat bias in workforce? And again, for me, this was very early days, but in a couple of cases, this tied right back to neurotechnologies, at least with a slightly broader definition. For example, one time someone said to me, hey, I have this wonderful startup idea, but I would drop it all if you could help me figure out how to do bipolar disorder. And it put a bug in my head, and I couldn't drop it. I spent the whole night reading papers about bipolar. I mean, I'm a neuroscientist. I know what it is, but I'm not a neuropsychologist. I don't know the fine details of the research in the space, or I didn't at the time. And reading these papers, I just convinced myself, I bet we could predict manic episodes in bipolar sufferers just using mobile phones. And then the craziest thing happened the very next day. I joined the board of a small startup that was building technologies to track people's emotional lives on their phones. Like, it was the perfect moment. And then to make it even better, one of the employees, so I said, I'll join the board if they let me build a system to predict these manic episodes as a side project. And one of their employees said to me, in confidence at the time, hey, I have bipolar. I overheard you guys talking. You can use all of my data. And sure enough, we were able to use, without a direct interface at all, just based on GPS, gyroscope, accelerometer data, some other things, but like movement data turned out to be really informative. We could see evidence of an emerging manic episode long before they were aware of it, in some cases 3 weeks ahead of time. So, we can really think about invasive neurotechnologies, or what I call funny hat, the non-invasive, but you still got to wear this big thing. But in fact, we can affect who we are just using the data that exists out there in the world. Anyone who's thinking right now, can't you do bad things with that data as well? Hell yes. Yeah, of course you can. And in fact, that was part of the heartbreaking part of that research is we could see people in our data set clearly having manic episodes. And we couldn't do anything about it because doing so would, for example, might disclose to their employer that they are bipolar. And we didn't know. That wasn't why they were using the app. This was not a medical app for them to get a diagnosis. So we felt trapped, like we couldn't do anything about it. So we've relaunched that project as a purely philanthropic one now, just to look at what we can do. But that broadens our horizons on what's possible in a space like this. Another domain we're looking at now with a non-invasive neurotechnology, more similar to the scope of Hum and others, is a project looking at phasic light therapy for Alzheimer's, dementia, and possibly even just depression. So one could look inside the brain using an EEG and see that, particularly when you think about a lot of very human complex type behaviors, like a lot of language and a lot of planning and memory things, you see a lot of activity in a certain frequency range, particularly around like 30 to 40 hertz, what's sometimes called a gamma band. And it turns out this group at MIT were just kicking around this idea. What if we flashed really high intensity light at that same frequency range, paired it with a sound in the exact same phase? Would this do anything with rats that effectively have Alzheimer's disease? And sure enough, they saw this big change. And I'll be perfectly honest. If you'd asked me a few years ago, could you go in and forget with a light, even with direct electrical stimulation, not just create a change in the brain, but it would be a meaningful one? I mean, something that might actually someday treat Alzheimer's or improve memory performance. I just said, come on, it's all epiphenomenal. There's no effect there. Turns out I was wrong. There is some very solid evidence that this stuff at least has transiently positive effects. And if you're staring at an Alzheimer's diagnosis, even that is a kind of hope that hasn't existed before. But again, it's not plugging into your brain. We're not putting electrodes directly on your skull. The company on whose board I sit, I'm not going to name anyone in any of these cases. They're just building a little box that flashes a light with some really cool advances in understanding the nature of color. And the idea that something like that could prolong someone's life, or at least quality of life, that's huge. That's amazing. And it, again, doesn't require you to go in for brain surgery. I don't know when the day comes when elective brain surgery becomes a normal part, like cosmetic brain surgery, just because, I feel like my wit isn't quite what I'd like it to be. I want to up that. But that's been one of the exciting spaces, is the viability of non-invasive strategies for making real change in people's lives. So there's just a couple of examples of spaces where artificial intelligence or other sort of contactless technologies have actually shown some real positive effects in people's lives.
Yeah, fascinating. I think it doesn't really make its way yet into the public consciousness, from what I can see, just how fast some of this stuff is moving, and some of the incredible stuff that we're seeing in situations like the companies that you're involved in, Vivian. You're involved in 5 or 6 really fascinating companies that in some way are related to what's going on in the brain. And
well, what's funny, you mentioned earlier how the science was driving technology. Let's also be honest, a lot of it's been the other way around. So we all have this big cranial nerve called the vagus nerve, and it goes from from your your brain down into, and it innervates your gut and other parts down into your body stem. And many people probably don't know this, but in humans, once we get away from certain things like the cortex, you've got a whole separate nervous system down in your gut called the enteric nervous system. There are more nerve cells down there than are up in the older parts of your brain. And so there's a whole lot going on. So what people discovered is, wow, some of these signals in people's guts and coursing along the vagus nerve seem to have some relationship to things like depression and mood disorders. And so someone thought, well, what if we stimulated the vagus nerve? And in a funny sense, with no idea why it was going on, they found, wow, this actually seems to help with depression. And then they started following it up and up and up, and it got into what I guess we're going to call deep parts of the brain, because what we are talking about is called deep brain stimulation, getting up into the basal ganglia and these other deeper brain structures, and they stimulate there. And not only was it addressing depression, but things like Parkinson's, which seems completely unrelated, and it seemed like it would treat everything. And we didn't know why. What a crazy thing to let technology, sticking this electrical stimulation, and people try phasic stimulation, and they just try a direct current and all these different things, and it helped. And people didn't, it's only recently they would just begun to get ideas of what's really going on in the biophysics of that process, much less the neurophysiology more broadly. And so knowing, and being honest about it, like in some of the cases here, the tail's wagging the dog. I guess our dog has like a lab coat on and a degree from Caltech, and the tail is industry, or at least medical application. Because if it makes someone's better, just follow it. It's certainly not unique to neurotechnologies, right? We see this a lot in neuropharmacology as well, the treatments for schizophrenia and depression, SSRIs and others. For the longest time, we did it because it worked, not because we knew why. And maybe one of the best examples is actually a bipolar disorder. Like, why does it work? And why does it only work on half of people? It's amazing that this has been a standard treatment for a major neurodisorder, maybe the biggest one. And we didn't understand it until essentially the last decade, what was going on. So, I guess I used to joke when neurotechnologies, go full in industry and you have to have a customer service department, then we'll start to really understand how this stuff works. I mean, I love science, but it can be a little plotting sometimes. Things are accelerating.
Fascinating. Yeah, when you were talking about maybe the dog in the lab coat, one of the things that I was thinking was there was this funny product a couple of years ago. I don't know if you saw it. It was an EEG, one of those brain sensing headsets for dogs, so that you could put it on when your dog was barking, and you could combine that with like their bark data and find out what they were thinking and feeling. So, yeah, what a time to be alive, hey? We're talking about,
finally, the human condition solved, or at least the canine condition solved. And I bet we can really probably brainstorm down, the three things: feed me, pet me. We don't need to speculate further on what it is doggy wants, but I got to go walkies.
Yeah, I guess even just segueing from the dog example, I mean, the dog's brain is so much less complicated than the human brain, but even then, that was a really challenging problem, and it was a hard product to build, partly because we don't know a lot about the dog brain, but to talk about the human brain, I think it's clear, like listening to the things that you're talking about, as we learn more, we're having some incredible capabilities pop up for things that we can do, helping people with Alzheimer's and the other things you mentioned, but just as exciting is the fact that we know so little still about the brain, and there's so much to learn and so much more to discover. And so I really think that a lot of people don't realize how this century, I think, is going to be something of an awakening about how we experience our lives and use our brains, because we're just learning so much and having so many cool discoveries.
Yeah, you'll often come across people saying, we know nothing about how the brain works, or others that think we've nearly figured it all out. It's one of those classic cases where my rule of thumb is however complex you think it is, it's more complex than that. But that does mean we're learning, right? The advances have been huge. It just turns out, oh my goodness, there is so much more nuance here. There's transcriptomics and large-scale brain networks and synchronous activity and everything from the molecular scale to the entire body and even distributed beyond that. Recognizing one of the things we've done is recognize how big and complex the system is that is our brains, that's us really when it boils down to it. And that's why there are so many ways that you can tap into this. When I was younger, I can think of a couple of the domains in which people were putting the most effort into neuroprosthetics. I mentioned one already, cochlear implants. The other that was sort of hot at the time were motor prosthetics, an exploratory space, but the first human work had been done. And there's a good reason why those two were so far ahead of everywhere else, because inside your ear, there is essentially like the keys of a piano, all laid out by frequency, from low to high, and then it's kind of all wrapped up. And so you could just stick a bunch of wires in there and stimulate these different frequency places, or what's called tonotopy, in the cochlea, this inner ear part, which is technically, a part of your brain, or at least directly innervates a part of your brain. And so in that sense, it's simple relative to the rest of the brain. It's simple. Turns out the motor system had something kind of similar. We have this stretch of primary motor cortex, M1, you might call it. And in it, basically, there's like a whole map of our body, including little sections that are hands and tongues and arms. And so if I just go in and I record from that part, so for this ear, right, it's sensory, we're stimulating individual parts of that tonotopy. But for the motor prosthetic, I want to read out. So I just put all these wires in and they read out these different parts of the brain. And you find a cell that seems to really like it. They don't care about anything. They're just little cells, but bear with my anthropomorphizing them. They like reaching in this direction. And another cell really prefers reaching in this direction. And they found that all they had to do was record all this activity and then average it together. And if predominantly the cells were reaching here, that's how the robot limbed reach also. So it required so little understanding of the actual brain function to make progress that we were able to make progress. Well, Alzheimer's isn't like that. Memory, whether it's long-term memory or working memory, is so much more complicated than that. The hippocampus, God, if anyone stuck wires in there, like that's a crime. You should do nothing like that. So making progress in spaces like that seemed impossible. We didn't have good theoretical models of what was happening, so you couldn't make any progress on the technology and the engineering. But now we can recognize things like, well, maybe the microstructure of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is still a little complicated, but we can see that some of what it's doing is essentially modulating the activity in other parts of our brain that are farther back, more posterior, parietal, and so forth. Well, what if we could just increase the strength of that relationship? Allow it to take a little bit more influence over these posterior regions. Well, it turns out if you do that, then working memory goes up. And if you do similar things more medially in the frontal lobe that might be involved, for example, in emotion or emotion regulation, you can actually see benefits there as well. So it turned out we didn't have to understand exactly what the brain was doing at a microarchitectural level to be able to play some improved role. So for example, in autism, it really looks like there are connectivity deficits. This may not be the whole of what autism is, but different parts of the cortex are not talking to each other as robustly as what we would call a neurotypical person. Well, it seems pretty clear that we could actually help that. We could help interplay that transcortical communication. Why would that be interesting? Because, you know, so much of how I imagine you as an audience member think of who you are. You know, if you got in trouble, would you feel like you needed to lie to get out of trouble? Or would you never do that sort of thing? Would you begin sweating if someone told you you have to get up on stage? Or do you just roll with these sorts of things and keep it together? Understanding how to produce that in the brain is incredibly complicated, but understanding how to modulate it is something we now know how to do. And seeing these kinds of technologies come into play is really exciting.
So exciting. I mean, you know, one of the numbers that people often throw out to explain just how complicated the brain is that there are as many connections between neurons in the brain, something like 100 trillion, as there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So it's a pretty complicated system, but at the same time, it's also just incredible how much we can do even today at a very early stage of our development of this industry with these simple techniques like what you're talking about. And on that note, we do have about 15 minutes left, and I would love to talk a little bit about how this industry is going to develop and some of the challenges. To start us off, I think something that I often say to people, Vivian, and I'd love to get your thoughts, is that working in neurotechnology right now, I kind of feel like I imagine someone might have been feeling about working in the internet industry in like the late 80s, early 90s. We are having an effect, like we are able to already do really cool things. Some of the stuff that you've mentioned is game changing for people, but we also can feel that it's not even really yet begun. We're putting these technologies together and starting to see even more incredible discoveries and results from the things we do. We're really yet to see a lot of massive commercial successes outside of perhaps the medical industry. We're really coming to grips with the fact that this technology could actually, in the way that maybe AI and a couple of other technologies like that will in the 21st century, really define what it is to be human. But of course, when the internet became more and more adopted, it didn't necessarily benefit everyone at the start. And even with things like social media more recently, we've seen that technology doesn't always help people homogeneously and in a democratic way. And one of the things that I love about your work, Vivian, is that it's really focused on making sure that we do good here and we learn from the way that those technologies are developed in the past. So I wanted to ask you if you could tell the audience a little bit about your perspective on just in maybe the short and then the longer term, who are going to be the people to be affected and benefited, and what are some of the challenges that we have as an industry to make sure that we're really helping people and everyone too?
Yeah. You know, we have really short memory spans when it comes to new technologies. The iPhone was the first smartphone. Well, that's funny because before the iPhone came along, I owned an HP Windows CE phone, and I had a Handspring before that and a Philips Nino before that in the 90s. And it had color screens and ran programs. I actually loved my little Nino. I'm sure now it would feel like I'm carrying around a whole computer with me with no power whatsoever, but still, it existed long before the iPhone. You know, it's 10 years before the iPhone came out. The first genuine smartphones existed. Nobody remembers them anymore. Steve Jobs invented the smartphone. AI, Jeff Hinton's lab is a famous AI researcher. They won an image recognition contest in like 2006 using the very earliest kinds of deep neural networks. And within a few years, that technology really took off, and now it's everywhere. I mean, in some ways, ways that we don't appreciate. Like I love, particularly my wife loves, who has hearing loss, that she can hop in a video chat and in real time, a conversation which will never take place again with no human doing transcription can get usable real-time transcription at the bottom. And that's modern artificial intelligence. So it essentially entered our lives in 2012. Well, no, the entire internet economy is based on AI. All those bidding wars for your attention involving ads, that's all artificial intelligence. We just don't think of it that way. We've sort of forgotten where we started. Well, we're here in a similar place with neurotechnologies. Again, cochlear implants have been around for a fairly long time, like decades. And motor neuroprosthetics, the first work in that space was just after the turn of the century, right? 2001, 2002 in humans. I mean, people with chronic implants driving robotic limbs or controlling cursors. There's this great video of this guy who was in a motorcycle accident, been for like the last 6 years, profoundly paralyzed. He rolls out in a wheelchair and he's got this giant thing, like literally glued to his head. It's dental cement that's in a hole and it's sitting on top of his head. And they say, you see that screen, you see the screen. This is going to be a deep cut for anyone who isn't 150 million years old, but it looks like a Commodore VIC-20 screen or something. And so it's like this giant blocky screen. And they say, just imagine you're moving the cursor. And he's like, what am I supposed to do? And they say, well, just imagine you're moving your hand in a circle, which he obviously can't do. He's profoundly paralyzed. And then suddenly the cursor starts to shake. And then it starts to move. And he starts screaming, holy shit, holy shit. Like this is the first thing he's moved on his body other than like his face and his eyes in 6 years. And now he's moving a cursor on a screen. And again, that was nearly 20 years ago. Yeah. So we've seen this progress coming, but it's been a lot of scientific curiosities and very particular medical applications. Now we're on the border of something like an internet revolution. And yeah, even there, I remember when I was a kid, putting the phone on the hook and having the dial tones and having a tape drive over here. Not that engaging unless you were a phenomenal nerd that really wanted to get on early message boards. But that was the precursor of everything we know today. And you could really see that early concept there. But frankly, it was allowed to evolve in a way that people didn't pay a lot of attention to. So much of what we hate about the internet today came about just because we let people move fast and break things. Yeah, that's a little bit of a dig, but let me ask you quite honestly, I don't think of Mark Zuckerberg as a villain. I don't love Facebook, but I don't think he's a bad guy. But do we really want Mark and Elon Musk and a handful of other billionaires that have been first movers in this space? They all have neurotechnology companies. Do we want them deciding, the industry norms for our own brains? Do you want Facebook in your head? It'll be another domain to gather information about who you are, except here, better than you know yourself, like deep information. And this is a field that already exists. Neuromarketing has had many successful startups, actually. Huge acquisitions have happened in this space. Understanding how our brains are responding in ways we can't even control. That's terrifying, and justifiably terrifying. I'm not worried about the Borg. I'm worried about neurotechnologies being used to invade our lives, being used for bioautocracies, being used to predict our behavior in ways that we can't essentially avoid. So there's some things that I think are really important that we put forward here as core principles. And many of these others have brought up as well. Like I have a right to decide who I am, and what I'm willing to share. So other people shouldn't be able to influence that. But we have already talked about technologies here that can influence my memories, it can influence my preferences, my honesty, my creativity, emotion regulation. No one should have those sorts of decision powers over me. But there's another domain here, which is, and it comes up a lot when people hear this one aspect of what I do with my time, which is, but what happens when, in a sense, we're not good at anything anymore, right? It's all the machines making all the decisions for us. Kind of like we're Eloy, except from the outside, we still look normal. We're all just little kids that never had to grow up because we have our own built-in parent making all of our decisions for us. Here's something I believe deeply. It's not just about neurotechnologies, but I actually developed this philosophy working in neurotechnologies. I should not only be better when I'm using the technology, I should be better than when I started, when I turned it off again. So if I got an implant, a chronic implant, if I'm using a non-invasive technology, or even these sort of broader, more diffuse technologies like the bipolar system, its express purpose should be to make that intrinsic me better. The things I truly have. In some places, obviously, with major spinal injury or advanced neurodegenerative disease or sensory deprivation, and even there, that's can be really controversial in the deaf community. There are places where there's nothing, a replacement is needed, and a permanent augmentation is called for. But everywhere else, like our own memory, the starting point of a memory prosthetic should be that it actually isn't replacing our memory. It's making our memory better. It's not replacing our emotion regulation. It is improving our brain's own intrinsic ability to regulate itself. For example, improving the coupling between medial prefrontal activity and amygdala activity that defines so much, for example, of emotion regulation, fear, and even social skills, really getting mediated through these sorts of broader level circuits. So I want to build better people. And here's another thing. My son has autism, he has diabetes, he's a cyborg. I got to turn my son into a cyborg, and it's the kind of cyborg I want. Yes, I tried to develop a system. I don't want diabetes, I want it to go away. But I don't want the autism to go away. My son has a superpower. Someone walks into a room and I'm looking at a sofa through a window here, it looks black to me, but I know it's blue. But I'm an authority figure. I founded a bunch of companies. I'm really important. My employees start walking into the room and I'm saying that black sofa in there, I guarantee you, they all agree with me that it's black. Here's a cool finding. They will actually perceive it as more black simply because I planted that idea in their head. Our brains are so wired into social signals, we will change the way we see the world to fit in. My son won't. People with autism are essentially resistant to those sorts of social cues. Now that can cause problems, but it's also a superpower. They see the truth, at least more veridically than we do. So I didn't want to build something that cured autism. I wanted to build something that preserved what was special and unique about him, but also allowed him to interact with the world. I wanted to build a translation system that allowed my son and everyone else to interact with a little less friction than would normally be there, given the cue of all the secret language of faces that the rest of us get for free. So that's my last call for neurotechnologies. Build technologies that actually augment what make us unique and different, not technologies that just arbitrarily make us all the same. We'll all be these smart, well-regulated, and largely indistinguishable people. And let me tell you, I am waiting, especially now that all these kids are from home, someone is going to be the first kid to cheat on a test using neurotechnologies by boosting their working memory, boosting their emotion regulation because they want to perform better under the stress of the test, whatever it might be. This is going to happen, like 2001, maybe even already happened in 2020. This is going to happen. if it hasn't already.
Hmm.
If someone gets that advantage, everyone has to have that same advantage, or at least the right to choose for themselves. It needs to be like a vaccine, something that is everyone's right, not just a civil right, a human right, which you can refuse, but one which is available. Because otherwise, you said it, we are staring at a future in which the definition of what it means to be human is going to change. It will change. Not maybe, not there's this cool story I read. The definition of what it means to be human is going to change. And the fundamental question is, for whom?
It's fascinating, Vivian. I mean, people may not realize, but companies like where we're making this little patch that you put on your forehead and it improves your working memory temporarily. We're confronting these issues today. These are not science fiction anymore. These are not issues that we can just laugh at and say, that's the kind of thing I'd see in a movie or something like that. These challenges that Vivian's just briefly mentioned in the short time we have of encouraging neurodiversity and making sure this isn't the domain of billionaires, and making sure that those billionaires and the big tech companies they run don't break our brains in the process of moving fast, or even just make our lives objectively and subjectively worse in the way that some technologies in the last 10 years debatably have. But Vivian, we're coming towards the end of our time. I did have one little story just before we wrap up, which is just that I'm not sure if I ever told you, but I think I may have been one of the first people in the world to have ever had my brain hacked. I one day was sitting in the lab. We had just completed a new prototype, hooked it up to the software, and I was there late playing a computer game on my office computer, and actually one of our engineers logged into the system from home, didn't realize that I was connected to the device, and started electrically stimulating me remotely, and I didn't realize, and all of a sudden I got better at the computer game. So
that's the funny thing is, I think a lot of people's vision, again, from science fiction, and I love science fiction, if you went in and I stimulated parts of your insular cortex using your existing rig without you realizing it, and I made you, I increased your subjective preference for the thing you're looking at, which happens to be my product, my movie, the ad that I'm showing you. So I hack it. So I really subtly, whenever you see my ad, you actually are like, yeah, that looks really great. When normally you would never feel that way. Yet that's actually your judgment. You do feel that way, and you wouldn't even realize it was going on. That sort of thing, I think, is legitimately scary, and is a legitimate concern. We need to treat it as a real problem now, because if we wait too long, we're going to end up with everything that we have come to love and loathe about the internet, except it will be us. And we need to collectively make those decisions right now, not first mover entrepreneurs or crazy mad scientists. All of us need to be making these decisions.
Well, yeah, we've run out of time, Vivian, but just ended on that note. Like I think that your work is incredibly important, and underappreciated in the public consciousness, how important it will be to continue thinking in the way that Vivian does, and the work that she does, and supporting the companies that she does. But Vivian, I'm sure there'll be lots of people who would be really interested to follow you ongoing, and have heard some cool things from you today. They'd like to find out more specifics. How could they get in touch and find out more about what you're doing?
Absolutely. If you visit socos.org, SOCOS, you'll find my philanthropic lab. People bring us incredibly challenging problems, and if I think my team can make a difference, I pay for everything. And if we come up with a solution, we just give it away for free. That's awesome. So at socos.org, you can find some of the stories of the projects we've worked on, including, as you may be able to see, some of our work in neuroprosthetics, and some of the stories of hacking my own son's body. Although, in my own defense, it is truly terrifying when your son has a life-threatening disease. So this is, let's call it hacking for good.
You're a superhero, Vivian, and I'm so grateful, not just for your time today, but for your continuing help in this industry and in my company too. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. If anyone's interested in learning a little bit about Hum, the company that I run, just go to thinkhum.com or anywhere on social media at thinkhum. It's been fantastic to talk to you, Vivian, and I'm looking forward to doing it again at SX next year. So we'll talk to you soon.
We'll make it happen. It was lovely meeting everyone from afar.
Look forward to all being back in person soon. Thanks, everyone.